and welcome everyone to the third lecture of Adhyapan-Lecture series. I am Amit Kanal, a rising sophomore at Lehigh University, Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, in USA. So today I'll be like the moderator of today's lecture. So I'll be just bridging the communication gap between our audience and professor. So before starting the lecture, I'd like to talk a little about our organization. So we call ourselves the Federation of International Nepali Students, and we are an organization trying to connect Nepali students scattered like over the globe, with a motive to bring positive changes in our existing situations through a program like this. So that's all about us and about today's lecture. Today we have Dr. Nathan Schmidt, who will be talking about logical fallacies and biases that make us love them. So Professor Schmidt is an adjunct professor at Lehigh University and Lafayette College. I don't know the other colleges that you are in, Professor.
Oh, so many. It's just, yeah, don't worry about it.
I'll just go with that.
Yeah.
Yeah, I kind of have a personal experience with Professor Schmidt. I had a privilege of taking critical reasoning and thinking class with him last semester, and that was really amazing. So the content of that course was really interesting, and it kind of encouraged me to challenge my preconceived ideas. I guess that was the main objective of that class. And yeah, and at times I used to feel like I wish I could share this to my friends in Nepal. And so here we are today. So I think we got this opportunity, and I feel really glad that you all are here today. So before really starting this, I would like to remind our participants that if you have any questions, you can either type that or use the raise hand feature. So if you type the question, I'd be reading it out for you. And if you use the raise hand feature, I'll be calling out your name and then you may proceed to speak. Also, this is a very important reminder that please turn your microphones off while the lecture is on. And without delaying anymore, let's welcome Professor Schmidt. Professor.
All right. Great. Thank you. Thank you so much for inviting me to talk to you all about this. He is correct. He was a student in my critical thinking class and was a great student at that. And part of what this lecture comes from is a combination of a couple sections of that talk. I'm going to apologize now if I'm not looking directly at you. My camera's really high and my screen's really low. So if I'm looking at my screen and not looking at you, please don't take that as an indication of my not caring about you. All right, so let's start with an introduction about what I'm going to talk about. Everyone can see this, correct? You can see the, okay. So what I'm going to talk about is logical fallacies and their accompanying biases, why we end up loving them so much. And so what I'm going to do first is talk a little bit about the connection between logic and value, a connection that's not often made by a lot of folks when they talk about logic and reasoning. Then I'll talk a little bit about general types of logic, the deductive and inductive logic, and their fallacies, like sort of how fallacies can arise in logic. And then we're going to take a left turn in a way that a lot of discussions and examinations of logical fallacies don't do, which is we're going to take a look at our minds. We're going to like poke around in here and go, what's going on in here that makes us see these errors? And then I'm going to give you some examples of those. So that's the idea. So let's go ahead and start off looking at logic and value. So just a big sort of overview of philosophy, which means the love of wisdom. And supposedly that means that philosophers are wise or love wisdom. It actually doesn't follow that they are wise, they just love wisdom. We can roughly break philosophy down into three sections. One I call ontology, which is more often referred to as metaphysics. And that's the study of reality, the study of existence, what things exist, what's real, what are the different things that are real. Epistemology is the study of knowledge, right? How do we come to know things? How do we come to understand things? And that's can be different from ontology, right? We could say something's real that we can't know, or we could say that we can only know real things. There's all sorts of crossover here. But the last field is the one I want to sort of stress with you all, which is axiology, the study of value. Three rough categories of axiology for the study of value are ethics and aesthetics, are probably the most common ones, which ethics, is morality. It's sort of what ought we do? What should I do? Should I go around murdering people? No, I shouldn't do that. So because ethics tells me I shouldn't do that, and good ethics. There's aesthetics, which is the study of like art, the study of beauty. But here's that third little category sitting there under axiology, the study of value. I've got logic under there. And when you think about logic, you probably don't think about value. You probably think it's supposed to be this cold, hard, unemotional, sort of robotic way of being, this logic. Well, it's not quite that simple.
Professor, I'm sorry to interrupt. How do you use the presentation mode?
Am I supposed to do it? Do I do that?
Yeah.
All right. What do you need me to do?
Just so that one slide at a time. So like go to that over there. I mean, I don't know how to show this. Just go with it, then it's fine. Or you can go same time. Yeah.
There we go. How about that? Is that better? I have the thumbnails up, so I know where I'm going.
So it's fine. Yeah, go ahead.
All right. So speaking of logic under axiology, and the idea behind this talk being about fallacies, what is a logical fallacy? Well, a logical fallacy is fundamentally a bad argument, right? So it's an argument that's gone wrong. It's an argument that we think stinks. We think it doesn't have any value to that argument. And that's what logic really is. And when you're studying logic, you're studying what makes a good argument and what makes a bad argument. And logical fallacies are bad arguments, and that's a valued claim. And when I say they're arguments we do not value, that isn't even quite right, because the phrase we probably should use is they're arguments we should not value, right? And when we say we should not value them, well, then we've got ourselves another value claim. Whenever you have should or ought or something along those lines, you can see where logic really is falling under this axiological category. So when I say we shouldn't use logical fallacies, or we shouldn't value these types of arguments, you would think that could be the end of it. But maybe I've given you a little bit of a taste of why that's not really how it works, that we use and fall for and see and agree with logical fallacies all the time. So we use bad arguments all the time. So what's sort of happening with that? That's the overall theme. Why are we still so enamored? Why are we pulled towards these bad arguments? Let's make sure we're on the same page with logic to begin with. Let's make sure we're all sort of understanding the general types of logic and the fallacies that accompanying them. There are two general types of logic, and that is deductive logic and inductive logic. Deductive logic are arguments where if the premises are true, the conclusion has to follow. All right. So if you've got a situation where, so premises are, how can I put this? An argument is made up of, here's what I think is correct. Here's why I think it's correct. This part is the premises. All the reasons why is over here. And the conclusion is what I think is correct. So a deductive argument says, if these things are true, this thing must follow. Now, I don't know how many of you are familiar with a board game called Clue in the US. I think it's Cluedo in the UK. I don't know what it is elsewhere. But it's a murder mystery game where you're trying to figure out who did it. You got to figure out who did the murder, in what room, and with what weapon, right? And it's played by people get cards, and everyone's got a set of cards of different ones of these things. And if at any point in time you figure out that no one has one of these cards, then that card's got to be in this little envelope that has the murder weapon that says this is what's going on with it. So imagine that you're playing Clue, and you've gotten to the point where you're pretty sure the murder weapon is either the revolver or the candlestick, right? And then you play the game and you ask someone, hey, can you show me if you have the revolver? I actually don't fully remember how to play the game, but it's something along those lines. And they show you the card, and there's the card with the revolver on it. So if they've got the revolver, the candlestick has got to be the weapon, right? It has to be. If you're like, it's either the revolver or the candlestick, they've got the card for the revolver, so it's not the revolver. The murder weapon has to be the candlestick. Right? So let's put that in a logical form, right? I have P for the premises, and I've got C for the conclusion, right? So premise one, the murder weapon is either the candlestick or it's the revolver. Premise two, the murder weapon is not the revolver. Conclusion must follow, the murder weapon is the candlestick. And that has to be the case, unless someone's cheating, which don't play board games with them if they're cheating. So this has got to be the case, that the murder weapon is the candlestick. Ah, run away. Look how pretty that argument is, right? I put it in a nice little picture frame, right? It's a pretty argument. You've got these premises and the one and the other one, and together they give you that conclusion. It's so attractive. You just want to hang that on a wall somewhere. Except it's not that useful, right? I mean, that sort of argument we don't use all that often. There's not many fields or areas of study that use deductive logic, except when you're playing a board game. Or there's one other sort of major field that does handle these sort of arguments, and that's mathematics. Mathematics as a whole is deductive in nature, right? And so I sort of took a very basic math problem and put it into the deductive logic form, right? Premise one, we've got, all right, the number 2 means what we think it means, right? I know some of these are like, I don't remember ever doing math problems like this, but this is fundamentally what it boils down to. Premise 1, the number 2 means what we think it means. Premise 2, the number 3 means what we think it means. Premise 3, addition means what we think it means. And premise 4, the number 5 means what we think it means. See where this is going? Premise 5, add the numbers 2 and 3, conclusion is 5, right? And it's still pretty. I still have it in that nice math. This is what people talk about the beauty of mathematics, is in that same sort of feel of the deductive nature of it, that this stuff must follow. If all these things line up, it must follow this way. It's just pretty. And a fallacy in deductive logic, an error in reasoning in deductive logic, is actually very simple as well. It's basically this: if the premises are true and the conclusion is false, we call it invalid if it's deductive logic, right? So those premises that I gave you before, the same premises, but instead of my conclusion being 5, my conclusion's 7, I really should probably go back to elementary math, right? I mean, I've made a mistake here. That premise is clearly false. I'm sorry, that conclusion is clearly false when the premises were all true. And that's really what fallacies in deductive logic are. Let's move over to the other type of logic, that inductive logic, right? Inductive logic is different in that these are the types of arguments where if the premises are true, the conclusion is likely to follow. But it doesn't have to, right? It's likely to follow. let's look at an inductive argument. And notice it's not pretty right off the bat. I even made a slightly uglier, it's not in a frame. I've got it on a little like paste card with a piece of tape on it. This is not a pretty argument, right? Premise 1, 7 out of 10 car crash fatalities are the result of the person not wearing a seatbelt. And aside, I've completely made that number up. Don't use that in anything for any reason. I just made it up. All right. Remember, this is the idea if the premises are true. All right. So 7 out of 10 car fatalities are a result of the person not wearing a seatbelt. Premise 2, you and I are driving along. We're in a car crash. Premise 3, I'm wearing my seatbelt. Premise 4, you're not wearing your seatbelt. Why aren't you wearing your seatbelt? You should wear your seatbelt. Conclusion, you are more likely to die in this crash. It's not, like I said, it's not a pretty argument because you got all these like 7 out of 10 and you're more likely and this and that. This isn't anywhere near as pretty. There's all kinds of like little wiggle room in this one, but it seems correct, right? Again, made up number aside, this seems like it's a good argument. It's a correct argument. It's not pretty, but that's good. Must it be the case that I live and you die? Right? Is that what's going to happen with this argument? If we get to the conclusion you are more likely to die in this car crash, fine, we're in a crash. I'm wearing my seatbelt. You're not wearing your seatbelt. Does that mean I live and you die? No, right? With this inductive argument, the conclusion is likely to follow, but it doesn't have to. Right? I could be trapped in the burning car trying to get my seatbelt off, and you are flung free from the car, and you've landed on top of a pile of fluffy marshmallows that a truck has spilled out or something like that. And you're like, whew, that was safe, and I'm the one with the seatbelt and can't get out. So, inductive logic arguments, not as pretty, not as tight, this wiggle room sort of issue at the bottom, but we use inductive logic a lot more than we use deductive logic. Most of the things that we do, most of the studies, most academic studies, science is inductive in nature, right? That's how science works, which should give you a little sort of interesting pause. We have this push for STEM, right? STEM, science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. And we've got this conception in our heads about mathematics and science. They're the bookends, right? They sort of work hand in hand. But here we got mathematics as deductive and science as inductive. And worse than that, I'm not going to dig too much into this, but just as an aside, if you've got a good inductive argument, that's an invalid deductive argument. That's a bad deductive argument. If you've got a good deductive argument, that's actually a bad inductive argument. So the two bookends of STEM, I guess it's good we've separated them with technology and engineering in there. And if you know, I might be a little biased, but maybe we should put the silent P in front of it and make it philosophy, science, technology. And I'm biased. So inductive fallacy, inductive logic, because we use it more, the fallacies are much more varied. There's a whole lot of more ways that inductive arguments can go wrong than deductive ones. As I said, if you remember early on in the talk, I talked about how I'm going to go through logic and value and general logic and the fallacies. And then we're going to take a side trip. And the side trip we're going to take is, well, we're going to go back in time to look at cognitive biases and mental heuristics. If you're not familiar with the phrase heuristic, it just means like a rule of thumb. It just means like it's not like a dead set rule, but just like generally speaking, you should do this sort of thing. So for me, when I play video games, I have got, sometimes in video games, you've got different paths you can take. And I have a heuristic, a rule of thumb that says, if I'm not sure where to go, just take the left door first or take the left route first and then move on from there. That's just a heuristic, right? I don't have to. It's not set in stone. It's not deductive, but that's what's happening with that. So that's what heuristics mean. Let's take a trip back to what some folks call the EEA, the Environment of Evolutionary Adaptedness. Now, this is John Bowlby's phrase, but a lot of people use this idea. The idea of this is going back to when humans were hunter-gatherers, when we lived in small communities, when we didn't really have much to do except survive, which we were good at. Human beings were very good at it, but we mostly lived in, trees and then on the plains and so forth. And what some think is that this is the time that human brains were becoming human through evolutionary mechanisms. Now, some of you might be going, all right, I'm out. Just give me a second to sort of support this in a way that I need, okay? Because I want to give you this quick caveat on what's known as evolutionary psychology. There are many problems with evolutionary psychology. There are many problems with their methods, because again, we don't have a time machine. There are many problems with their conclusions and all kinds of misconclusions and all kinds of things that are, so be really careful with evolutionary psychology and their claims. But we don't necessarily want to just dismiss the idea that evolutionary mechanisms played no role in our brains being the way they are. That is also, to me, a little bit weird. If evolutionary mechanisms explain a lot about how living things are, and again, evolutionary stuff isn't about the origins of life, it's about how species diverge and become the way they are. We can talk about that later if you'd like. But the idea that evolutionary mechanisms handled things like my ears and my hands and didn't handle the brain, that doesn't seem right to me either. So while we want to be really, really careful with evolutionary psychology, there's something there. Let's see if we can do something with it. Here we go. Oh, I've got the card. It must be an inductive argument, right? Not pretty. You can already tell it's not pretty. Premise 1. Brains are physical and biological objects with phenotypic traits. What is a phenotype? Is a measure, something you could measure, so a measurable trait, being a certain height, being a certain weight, having a certain amount of bones. Those things, that anything you can measure can be a phenotypic trait. So that's premise 1. Brains are such a thing. Premise 2. Biological objects whose phenotypic traits are the result of genetic material that is heritable, right? Which, again, just fundamentally means the offspring resembles parents, right? That you've got parents and you resemble them in some way. That means that you've inherited some of that genetic material that gives you those phenotypic traits. If that's what they are, if that's biological objects that are like that, then those objects are open to evolutionary mechanisms. And I keep saying evolutionary mechanisms because there's more than just natural selection. There's not a ton of variety, but there are more than just natural selection. Genetic drift would be, to my mind, the next biggest one. So natural selection, you might be familiar with, that's Darwin. Genetic drift is just that sometimes you've got traits that don't hurt and don't help with fitness. And so what happens then is, just through statistic means alone, that trait can still end up in a given group. So anyway, that's not the same. Biological objects open to evolutionary mechanisms. Premise 3, there is a connection between brain and mind, right? I could spend another hour doing philosophy of mind with you all. I'm not doing that to you, right? But we know there's some sort of connection between brain and mind, because we know if you manipulate some parts of the brain, you can change thoughts. There's a famous case of a guy named Phineas Gage, who was a railroad worker who did explosives. So he would tap down the explosives to, I guess, blow up mountains so we could put railroads through. And one time in tapping it down, the metal rod that he was tapping went through the front end of his brain, and he survived, which is, and altered his personality, right? Somehow the physical change in the brain altered the personality. And these days we know that, right? So there is a connection between brain and mind. So, conclusion, it seems reasonable that evolutionary mechanisms could have and likely did play a role in our minds being how they are. Again, that's not pretty, right? That's not deductive. There's no pretty argument happening there, right? We have like reasonable and likely, and the conclusion could follow, but it doesn't necessarily. So it's an inductive argument, but hopefully that gives you at least a better feel for why I'm taking us back to this EEA, right? The evolutionary of the environment of evolutionary adaptiveness. Now, that's what some folks believe. They believe that main evolutionary mechanisms for the evolution of the human mind took place during the EEA. And some folks think it all took place during the EEA. Let's hedge our bets even more, right? And go, how much was done then? Probably not that much. The brain and the mind are what we might call super plastic. They're super variable. It's such a high level plasticity. In fact, sometimes you'll hear the mind is like a computer, right? Computational views of the mind. And I actually think a better analogy for the mind is our immune system, right? Our immune system is very plastic. We get a novel disease, and if we make it through it, our immune system now has changed and can handle that new illness. I think the brain and the mind is probably more like that. It's much more flexible. It's much more able to shift and change. At the same time, it still was open to evolutionary pressures. And so here we are, we're set up. Let's get back into our time machine. Let's head back to the EEA. All right. So I'm a hunter-gatherer with a banjo. And I've got to eat. And I've got, maybe my boss is coming over. My hunter-gatherer boss is coming over for dinner. And I've got to get some good grub for them to eat. And I've got options of berries. I've got 2 berry bushes, and I've got to figure out which berry bush I'm gonna get berries from. Orange ones or purple ones. How would I decide which of the 2 are good and which of the 2 are what we might call toxic no-no berries, right? You don't want to eat those. Probably the way I'd go about it is I would think about past experiences. Have I had one, or at least things that are similar to the one? Because I wouldn't have had that exact one, but maybe I've had things that look like that orange bush, and maybe I've seen like a dead animal around the purple one, or heaven forbid, I got really sick having a purple one at one point in time. But I'll think about that past experiences. I'll think about things I've seen. Again, like maybe seeing animals eat one and not the other, maybe seeing other humans eat that one type and not the other. Or maybe I've been taught it. Maybe it's just something that, was passed down by wiser people than I am, that the conclusion is the orange ones are safe. What is all that? All that's inductive reasoning, right? All that, like thinking back to what I've seen and experienced, thinking back to what I've been taught, and that I come to the conclusion that the orange ones are good and the purple ones are bad. That's inductive reasoning. It follows that the orange ones are likely safe to eat. Must they be? No, right? It could be the case that I'm confused that, yeah, these things look very, very close, if not to my eye, exactly like the safe ones, and they weren't. Sorry, boss, for giving you toxic no-no berries when you came to dinner. That's inductive reasoning, right? How much time could I spend as a hunter-gatherer doing this sort of inductive reasoning for all my hunting and gathering? I can't spend all day reasoning out like that. There's a saber-toothed tiger that somehow made it into a tree. I don't know if they can climb, but there's all kinds of dangers in the world that I can't spend my time sitting in front of a bush going, orange or purple, orange or purple. What should I do? Because the saber-tooth behind me is going, human on the left, human on the right. Which one should I eat? I think I'll eat the one that's sitting there doing the same thing I'm doing, right? we couldn't spend all our time reasoning. And bring us back into modern times, we don't spend all our time reasoning. It's just not how we are. We don't have the time to do that. It takes a lot of effort. It takes a lot of energy. To sort of ensure I don't spend my days in the stomach of another animal, evolutionary mechanisms seem to have put certain biases and heuristics in my mind, and probably somehow in the structure of the brain for which the mind is connected, that relieve me of this burden of constant reasoning, that sort of get me to conclusions that I probably, especially back in the EEA, probably would have come to the same conclusions using reasoning, but allows me to skip that so I don't spend time on it. So we have these biases and these heuristics. Now, if, again, you're not sold on the whole EEA thing, that's okay. We do know we still have these biases and mental heuristics. If you're like, I don't buy the evolutionary story you're telling here, fine. But I think that explains a lot about why we actually do have these cognitive biases and mental heuristics, because we still do have them. We have them, whether or not that story I told you is true or not. We have them. We've got these rationally independent, conscious independent decision-making thoughts, concluding thoughts. And by understanding those types of biases, that might go a long way, well, to help us understand the logical fallacies and why logical fallacies never go away. We have a game in like carnivals called whack-a-mole, which is this little flat board with holes in it, and you have a soft hammer, and sometimes this like little toy mole will pop out at different holes, and you're supposed to like whack it down as fast as you can. And that's what a lot of times it feels like when you're looking at logical fallacies. You're like, I whacked that one down, and it popped up over here. I whacked it down over there, it popped up over here. These things just never seem to go away. And I think the reason why these things never go away is from that story I told you, is from these cognitive biases and mental heuristics. And that brings me to the sort of heart of the talk, the fallacies and the biases that make us love them. And I'm going to mostly refer to them as biases, but, heuristics is also, whether we want to draw that clear distinction or not, it doesn't matter to me. But this is what we're dealing with, I think. And so what I'm going to do now is I'm going to talk about some logical fallacies. I'm going to give you an example of a few. And then what I'd like to do is talk about what I think are the biases and mental heuristics that explain, even though we can look at it and we can reason through why these are bad arguments, why we still end up falling for them, why we still like them. So that's the plan. So let's start with the internet's favorite logical fallacy, the ad hominem. Ad hominem means attacking the person instead of their argument or their position. So someone's giving you an argument saying, I'll go with one I like a lot, which is, I'm not a fan of whaling, or where people hunt whales, because I have a deep philosophical reason for why I don't like whaling. It's that I think they're cute. And so someone's like, I'm in favor of whaling. I'm like, no, I'm against whaling, and you're a jerk. And so I attack them. I don't attack their argument. I don't attack their position. I attack them. You're a jerk. Well, the reason it's a fallacy is, yeah, it might be true that they're a jerk, but it doesn't make them wrong. Right? That, if they're like, I am a complete, utter bad person, but I'm going to call grass green. You go, well, yeah, I mean, they're right about that. They're a bad person, but I'm not going to call them a bad person for that argument and for that conclusion. So that's the ad hominem. You're attacking the person rather than attacking or critiquing their argument. And pause real quick there too. When I say attacking, I don't mean like attacking. I mean like you are criticizing their argument, criticizing their position, right? So, right. What's the bias? So I've got my little brain diagram over there. And so coming out of the brain will be these biases and heuristics. And I see two biases that might help to explain why we want to attack the person and not their argument. Because as much as we want to be that rational, cool, like, yeah, I'm just going to go after their argument, I want to call that person a jerk. I'm not going to, but I want to smack him on the back of the head, right? So what can explain why we want to attack the person? And I think at least these two, there may be more, but I think at least these two might help explain it. And that one is what we might call halo effects. And the other one we might call the fundamental attribution error. Let's look at the halo effects first. What is a halo effect? What is this bias? What is this heuristic? Halo effects are something about us makes us want to take different aspects that we like or dislike about someone and bundle them together about that person, even if those aspects have nothing in connection. They don't connect at all. An example of a halo effect might help, right? So the example I've got is, if I think you're funny, like I've seen you a couple of times, we met for coffee, or I've seen you on campus, and I think you're a funny person. The halo effect bias, that mental heuristic, is going to automatically have me conclude you're nice to animals, even if I have absolutely no evidence that you're nice to animals. I've never seen you around an animal. I've never even heard you talk about an animal. But because I like you and I like funny people and I think you're funny and I like people who are nice to animals and I like being nice to animals, I'm going to connect that up with no evidence whatsoever. And it also works in this other way, which is if I see you being mean to animals, I won't find you funny anymore. Even though nothing changed about your humor, I thought you were funny before. That's how halo effects work. That's a mental heuristic we have, this sort of clumping of these things together, independent of any evidence. So I think halo effects might play a role in adonymism, but I actually think the next one might play a bigger role. The fundamental attribution error. Fundamental attribution error is when you attribute actions to others' personality, but you attribute your own actions to the circumstances. I know some of these are like trying to work through what they mean. It's usually much easier to get the example. So the example, and I think this one hits the nail on the head for fundamental attribution errors, is I'm driving along, right? Not in the car accident yet. I'm driving along and someone cuts me off. What do I think about that person that cut me off? That person's a jerk. I'm being polite because we're online. I wouldn't use jerk if I was actually driving. I'd use my driving finger. So I'd be like, you're a jerk. You're a bad driver. Rah, you're a bad driver. You're a jerk. I'm going to attribute that action of cutting me off to your personality. But if I'm driving along and I cut someone off, I'm like, oh no, I'm so sorry. Nah, I'm not a bad driver or a jerk. That was just the circumstances. I just didn't happen to see you, or that's not me normally, right? That's just the situation I'm in. I'm not, why are you flicking me off? I'm not a bad. This is what we tend to do. Again, mental heuristic. These aren't things I'm saying. These I'm saying are a part of, we know they're a part of the way our minds work. This fundamental attribution error. This is something we do. Right? We will attribute actions to people's personality, but not to ourselves. For ourselves, we'll attribute to circumstances or situations. So given the halo effects that will start to clump these variety of aspects together, such as, oh, you're anti-whaling. Well, I hate that, and I hate jerky people, so I think you're a jerk. And the fundamental attribution error, which is I'm going to attribute any of these actions to you specifically as your personality. Well, you can see why we fall in love with ad hominems. We can see how easily it is that we want to attack the person and not their position. So that's one of these. And that's what I'll do for several of these fallacies. So let's look at another one. Cherry picking. Cherry picking. Sounds not fun. Cherry picking, what's the fallacy? The fallacy, the error in reasoning for cherry picking is when folks only use data and research that supports the position and you ignore all counter evidence. This is probably how a lot of you first learn to write a paper, right? Which is go to the, you're in like elementary school or whatever, go to the library, pull a couple books on your topic and find the things that agree with you and write it out. And eventually, hopefully you get to the point where you start looking up counter positions and start using those in papers. Hopefully, yes, occasionally it might happen. Cherry picking is intentionally doing that, right? Cherry picking is intentionally only using the data that supports your position. Maybe you're running for political office and you want to make yourself feel better. What's a good way to do that? Only look at polls that are in your favor, right? And ignore any poll that's not in your favor. That would be cherry picking. And humans have written enough over the years that if you want to find someone to agree with you on a position, you can find. The internet is vast. You can find someone who will back you up on any ridiculous position you've got. Right? So that's cherry picking. What are the biases that make us love cherry picking? I think there's at least two. There's something called confirmation bias, and there's something, doesn't quite have a name, but it's basically the less knowledge you have, the more confidence you have in your knowledge, which is terrifying, right? Let's start with confirmation bias. Confirmation bias is not cherry picking. Cherry picking is supposed to be intentional. Confirmation bias is this mental heuristic, this mental bias we have, where we are more likely to pay attention to things we agree with and more likely to ignore things we disagree with. Confirmation bias is the demon of education. Because if you're trying to learn something new, if you're trying to get other information out there, your bias is, if you don't agree with it, you're kind of going to your eyes are just going to pass it by. Remember, this is not intentional. Confirmation bias is just the way we are. We pay attention to things we agree with. We don't pay attention to things we disagree with. Always? Not always. It's likely. You could clearly see the connection, though, between confirmation bias and cherry picking. But there's also a weird disconnect between how much we know something and how confident we are in that knowledge, which probably when I even say that, you're going, well, that's not me. All of this is all of us. This is human, right? The less we know about something, not if we don't know anything, but if we know a little bit about something, the more confident we are in our conclusions. There was a study by a guy named Amos Tversky. And the study was done with legal scenarios where they took two groups of people, two sets of subjects, and they gave both sets the same identical background information about a trial, a court case. So both groups had the same background information. One group was given the arguments from both attorneys. So that, like, say there was a prosecution and a defender, it wasn't quite like that, but say it was like that. They would hear the arguments from both of them. The second group would only hear the arguments from one of the attorneys. Right? So one group, both have the same background information. One group's got arguments from both lawyers. One group's got arguments from only one lawyer. The arguments from the lawyers contained no new information. All of the arguments from the lawyers could be found in that background information. But, and you probably can see where this is going, the folks that only heard arguments from one of the lawyers were much more confident that their conclusions were correct. Those that had less, even though they had the same background information, still had less because they didn't get the arguments from both sides, they only got one side, thought that they were more correct. A little knowledge is actually a dangerous thing. And in fact, there's a really great quote from Bertrand Russell. The whole problem with the world is that fools and fanatics are always so certain of themselves, and wiser people so full of doubts. So what's the connection between cherry picking and these? Well, again, if we only pay attention to what we agree with, and once again, this isn't an admonishment. This is how we are. Confirmation bias is how we are. Add to that if we don't really know all that much on the topic, but know a bit, when we present our case, when we present our argument, we're going to feel confident and we're just going to focus on that stuff. And cherry picking seems like it's inevitable. The straw man argument, the straw man fallacy.
Professor, sorry to interrupt, but
Sure.
there is a question from Outsource, and the question goes, does that mean every debate, be it political or non-political, is most likely to be cherry picking, and should we stop them? And if yes, how can we, like, from a personal level?
Yes, it is very likely. Years ago, there was the U.S. got involved in an Iraq war because they thought there were weapons of mass destruction. I don't know if any of you remember that. And the folks who were in charge kept presenting evidence, and the folks who were against it were like, you're just cherry picking the evidence. And the question is, how cynical are we? Were they really cherry picking, or was it confirmation bias? And I think it was mostly confirmation bias that leads us to sort of cherry pick. So yeah, I think it's the case because this is how we are. What can we do about it? I mean, I guess there's the cynical way of approaching this talk, right? Which is, there's nothing we can do about it because part of this is how we are. But maybe the less cynical is, if we're at least aware of it, that we could be this way, then we can be a little bit more careful and a little bit more suspect about the position that others have. It's not a cure-all, but maybe at the very least, it's a nice salve that we can put on that maybe can help a little bit. Thank you for the question. And please jump in with a question anytime. It'll give me a chance to grab something to drink. All right. Straw man. A straw man fallacy, it's named that because way back, if you were practicing for military and you needed to attack an enemy, you were training, you'd build a scarecrow, you'd build a straw person to sort of attack. Of course, attacking a straw person is really easy because they don't fight back. And then suddenly you're out in the field and you're like, these people are fighting back, run away. So we call it that because the fallacy is when you attack or critique an argument by basically looking for another argument, a simpler argument, a weaker argument, a more extreme argument, and attack that instead of the argument that you were supposed to be attacking or critiquing, right? So, and that's what a lot of examples take. They include taking a moderate position and twisting it into an extreme one, because it's easier to show how the extreme position is crazy. So someone might go, hey, I think we need to spend a little less money at the grocery store. And I might argue, we can't spend, what, you don't want us to eat at all? Is that what you're saying? You don't want us to have any food whatsoever? And I'm like, whoa, no, right? I was just saying we should spend less. I wasn't saying, oh no, you want me to starve, right? There's a straw man, right? It's easier to attack the argument that you don't want us to have any food whatsoever than it is to attack the argument we should spend less at the grocery store, right? That's how the sort of straw man arguments work. You can imagine something like, you can imagine people trying to decide how much, in speaking back to politics, how much they want to spend money on defense. They go, I think we should cut the defense budget. And someone's like, oh, you want us to be defenseless? I'm like, no, that's not, no. What is the bias or heuristic that makes us want to fall for and love straw man arguments? And I think that comes down to something that's known as substitution of hard questions. And again, some of these don't have good labels like fundamental attribution error, but it boils down to this. When we're presented with a difficult question and position, because positions can be, well, do you agree with this thing? We will often substitute that question with a simpler one that we feel more comfortable answering. And we'll use that answer for the hard question without realizing we substituted the question at all, without realizing we actually are looking at this easier one. And there's two parts that explain why we do the substitution of hard questions. One of them is the mental shotgun. Our thoughts are never, you've probably heard of a train of thoughts, how one thought leads to another thought leads to another thought. Our thinking doesn't really work like that. It's not that clean. It's not that simple. When we have a thought, we have a variety of thoughts at the same time, whether we're aware of them or not. Our minds make a variety of connections and perform a variety of assessments and tasks, whether we're aware of it or not. Let's see. Oh, I want to come back. All right. So for example, here's another study. This was done by Daniel Kahneman. Subjects were asked to assess a set of words that they would hear. So you get two sets of words. And you were supposed to tell whether or not they rhymed or not. And if they rhymed, you hit a button saying, yes, they rhymed. No, they didn't rhyme. These weren't written down. They were just spoken aloud. Do these. That sounds easy, right? Hip hop artists do it all the time. This is no problem, right? Words rhyme, hit the button, right? Okay, so one of the words would be vote note, V-O-T-E-N-O-T-E. They just say vote note. Does it rhyme? Boom. Yeah, it rhymes. Boom. Yeah, vote note. Boom. Okay, the next one would be vote goat. Boom. Clearly your ears go, vote. If I was doing an album, I'd get, let's vote for the goat, right? That's clearly rhymes. But when you look at the analysis, people slow down. People hesitate on tapping the button to say that vote and goat rhyme longer than vote and note. Why? Because not only is your mind going, do they rhyme? Do the sounds rhyme? Your mind is also spelling the words. It's also taking that little bit of extra time going, well, they're not spelled the same. Even though I'm not seeing them written out, your mind is still performing that task, still doing that connection of the difference in how they're spelled, which slows you down. All right. So your mind does all these things, whether or not you're aware of it, is all this is happening at the same time. We also have, and this is the second part for the substitution, what we might call intensity matching. We have a basic understanding of more and less. And we ascribe this basic understanding of more and less to everything everywhere, right? This basic understanding of more and less allows us to make comparisons amongst things that it doesn't make sense to make comparisons amongst these things. I'm going to pull some examples from Kahneman again. So he talks about a statement like this. Julie could read fluently when she was 4 years old. All right, so Julie could read fluently when she was 4 years old. All right, so here's some questions for you. What level of income in your profession matches Julie's reading achievement? Right now, you're probably actually going, yeah, all right. So she could read when she was 4. My profession, I'm a philosopher, so it's got to be like $1.50 because that's when we make a lot is philosophy. No, that's, but you probably have a figure. You might go like, well, $750,000 a year. That seems too much money for Julie reading when she was 4 years old. And I'm thinking 20,000 a year. That's way too low. A 4-year-old reading fluently? I don't read fluently now, so that can't be right. And you probably have a nice ballpark figure for comparing Julie reading when she was 4 years old to the amount of money someone makes in your profession. And I'd like to point out that's ridiculous. There's no comparison. There literally is no comparison. There's no way to come up with a number of money that matches her reading fluently when she was 4. That makes no sense. But we have no problem doing it. We have no problem making those kind of comparisons. I could do it again. How tall would someone be for Julie reading at 4? Like, what's the height of someone in comparison to Julie reading at 4 years old? you'll have a number, maybe a range, maybe not a specific number, but you'll have a range for, again, this nonsensical comparison. But we can do it. Why can we do it? Intensity matching. This ability to see more and less and ascribe it to a wide variety of things. The mental shotgun, this thing that where we do more cognitive tasks than we need to for any situation. Add to that intensity matching, and you end up with easy, intuitive answers to complicated questions, right? You will, instead of like someone saying, how much should we be spending on groceries a month? You'll substitute that with, how do I feel about going to the grocery store? How do I feel about eating? I like it. I'm a fan. And so I'll go, oh, I like eating, so we should spend a lot at the grocery store. I'll substitute that easier little how I feel about it, right? Thinking about the pizza I want to get from the store, and I'll substitute that for the hard question about how much money I want to spend. So again, that's, I think, where straw men arise, is we're more likely to respond to how we feel about positions that we can grasp rather than tough, nuanced, actual responses to things. Only got a couple more. Slippery slope. What's the fallacy? Slippery slopes are my favorite fallacy because people will literally tell you they're doing it. They're like, hey, we can't allow the legalization of drugs because it'll lead to people doing heroin, and it'll lead to the collapse of the world. It's a slippery slope. And they'll say it's a slippery slope. And to me, that's a nice little flag they're waving going, my argument isn't right. Right? A slippery slope is arguing that taking one position or step will inevitably lead to worse and worse consequences or worse and worse steps. Usually it ends up leading to the collapse of civilization. I don't know why slippery slopes always end there, but they tend to. What's the biases heuristics? Probably something about our mental heuristic of coherence and our mental heuristic for preferring causation over probability, right? What does that all mean? It basically means we love stories. We love stories. We want stories. Getting a stat is never as good as hearing a story. And slippery slopes are good stories, right? So the main issue with slippery slopes is the reliance on the inevitability of causal chains. But there are all kinds of events that causal chains aren't needed to explain. For example, children who suffer from hearing problems are more likely to have a best friend who has better hearing. Why? Why? Children who suffer from hearing problems are more likely to have a best friend who has better hearing. Why would that be the case? I bet most of you right now are coming up with a story for that, right? Well, you know, they probably, because they don't hear as much, it probably is useful to have a friend who can hear a little bit more. Maybe they're picking up on things that they didn't hear before. That might explain it, right? You probably have come up with some sort of story and some sort of causal story for that statement. But that statement doesn't need a causal explanation. You don't need a causation for that. Regression to the mean, the statistical idea of regression to the mean, explains why children with lesser hearing abilities than others will have a best friend who can hear better. Most children will hear better. If you've got a child who has a hearing problem, and since most children won't have the hearing problems, most likely their friend will have better hearing than them. That's just stats. You don't need a causal story. You don't need these children going, boy, I wish I had a best friend who could hear better than me. This is just odds, right? But that's not what we want. We want, in our heads, we want to have this causal story, and we want that causal story to cohere, to make sense. We are not statisticians. We have to work at being statisticians, and that takes a lot of effort, and that's not what we're like. So again, the connection between slippery slopes and this is, yeah, we want to tell causal stories that explain the world and what will happen in the world. And the more dramatic, the better it'll be as well. I mean, that's the sort of the drama of the slippery slope is what sort of draws us in. But the problem with most slippery slope arguments is there's ledges. And people like to ignore those ledges where you can get off and take the stairs up or down. Appeal to authority. I probably shouldn't do this one since I'm giving this talk, and here I'm going to tell you that you shouldn't necessarily believe anything I say, because the fallacy of appeal to authority is just because someone is in a position of authority or expertise, that authority or expertise isn't what makes their view correct. Just because they're in a position of authority doesn't make them right. If they're right, that correctness has to exist independent of who they are, independent of them being in a position of authority or an expert, right? Not that they are an authority or an expert. But boy, you're listening to me, suckers, right? Why appeal to authority? Probably, I think we're going to have these heuristics or biases. We have priming effects and a bias to believe. Priming effects are input, for lack of a better word, due to the association of ideas that we sort of saw with the mental shotgun, that can set us up to lean towards thinking a certain way as opposed to leaning another way, right? So for example, and this is coming from Kahneman as well, if I showed you a dirty, well, this example isn't, but if I showed you a picture of a dirty floor and a gross, like wet sort of towel laying on it, and then I showed you this set of letters with a blank, right? It has S-O blank P. And I said, what word comes to mind? You would be more likely to think soap comes to mind because you just saw this image of a dirty floor and a gross towel. No one said soap. No one said anything. You just saw the image. It primed you to think soap. However, if I didn't show you the dirty floor, I showed you a picture of chicken or I showed you a picture of food, you would be more likely to think soup. You'd be more likely to think of the U than the A. That's what a priming effect is. Add to that this bias to believe. It might surprise a lot of you, especially the more cynical of you, that the human mental default is to believe the things that are presented to us, is to, when we're given a new piece of information, believe what that information is saying. It takes an extra step or an extra thought to disbelieve something. And to sort of even disbelieve it, you have to, in your mind, with that association of ideas, you have to sort of entertain it as possibly being true to then dismiss it as not being true. And for those of you who are like, think about all the times where you were first reading on a new topic and whatever you last read was the thing you agreed with, right? That's that bias to believe, right? That's what's happening here. And so combine these two again. Our default position to believe statements when we first hear or see them, plus priming effects to go, well, they are authority, they're an expertise. So I've already got a bias to believe, and I've got a prime that they're a position of authority. You can see why we would fall into this, why we would fall into this fallacy. One last one, and I know we're getting ready to move on to more questions that you have for me, if you have any. The appeal to ignorance. What's the fallacy of appeal to ignorance? Drawing a conclusion based on the lack of evidence. So I've got a picture on the screen of a silly ghost, right? So appeal to ignorance could work like this. Last night, I was asleep in my room, and my dog was there, and my wife was there, and I heard footsteps coming up the stairs. I heard footsteps. It wasn't me. I was in bed. It wasn't my wife. She was there. It wasn't my dog. My dog was there. But I heard footsteps coming up the stairs. I don't know what could have made those footsteps. It must have been a ghost. You just said you didn't know what it was, and then you just said it was a ghost. You literally went from I don't know what it could be to a conclusion it's a ghost. That's an appeal to ignorance. What is the bias, the mental heuristic that probably makes us want to make that conclusion? I'm going to call it evidence blinkers and overconfidence. So blinkers are what you would put on a horse so they only can look in one direction. That's a blinker. And like blinkers on a horse, we have a really hard time imagining what missing evidence, especially evidence that might change our beliefs or our minds on something, we have a hard time imagining what missing evidence would look like, what it would be like. Especially if we can tell ourselves a good story without it. We're definitely going to do that. Go back a few slides, right? And if we can't think of any evidence, any missing evidence, well, there must not be any missing evidence. So any conclusion we must come to then must be correct because we've got all the evidence that you could possibly have. And that, of course, makes us much more overconfident. So what's the connection? Well, if the evidence we know about it, if we know about that evidence, it's got to be good evidence because how else will we know about it if it's not good evidence? So if we don't know about some evidence, well, how good could it be, right? And so that leads us to just going, well, I don't know. So no one could know. So here's your conclusion. It's got to be right. All right, so here's my conclusion. What's the takeaway, right? And I already know it frightened of some of you early on. We're like, what can we do about this? This is what people were like. What's the takeaway? Must we be this way? Yes and no is the takeaway. Yes, these biases and heuristics are a part of us, at least as much as we know about human minds at this point in time. That could change later on. Science is inductive and tentative. The conclusions are likely, but not necessarily. But it seems to be the case, these biases and heuristics are a part of us, human qua human. Like qua just means in the role solely as, right? It's part of being a human being. We have these mental heuristics and biases. So yes, we must be this way, but no. Remember what I said early on, the brain and mind are plastic. We can change them in meaningful ways. There's all kinds of really interesting studies on the plasticity of the brain and the mind. So we can sort of, and I think this might be at heart why I like talking about these, is if you know about these fallacies and you know about the biases and heuristics that might explain why we're pulled towards these things that we know are errors in reasoning, maybe we've got a shot of using that plasticity to our advantage. At the very least, though, let's maybe be a little kinder to each other, be a little bit kinder to those we're arguing with and critiquing with. Let's remember to be kind to those who fall for and use logical fallacies because they're us. Thanks.